The Battle of the Little Bighorn, also called Custer's Last Stand and known to the Lakota and other Plains Indians as the Battle of the Greasy Grass, took place on June 25, 1876, in Montana, close to the Little Bighorn River. The United States Army's 7th Cavalry Regiment, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, engaged in combat with combined forces of the Lakota Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes. The Great Sioux War of 1876's most important engagement was the battle, in which Native Americans defeated American forces. Following the Civil War, land in the far west became scarce, and the U.S. government developed aspirations for the Plains land by constructing railroads and providing settlers with favorable land purchase prices. The Great Plains were the last Native American stronghold in America. Before the Civil War, settlers had colonized the far west, but few had established roots there because of the region's dry climate and sizable native population. It was inevitable that the settlers and government soldiers would clash with the Plains Indians. The majority of Native Americans had either been slain or evicted to so-called Indian reserves by the late 1860s. The Plains people settled in for a protracted and valiant holdout because they were determined to avoid suffering the same fate. The government permitted hunters to kill buffalo herds in order to install railroad tracks with the intention of destroying Native American livelihoods. Additionally, they exhorted hunters to kill as many buffalo as they could. The tribesmen were more irate as the hunters killed more buffalo needlessly. Regardless of age or gender, some organized vicious attacks on railroad workers, hunters, and settlers. Custer, who had previously served on the Union side during the Civil War, entered the conflict in 1866. At that point, the Army and the Plains Indian tribes were engaged in a full-scale conflict. Custer led a successful campaign against a Cheyenne community in the years that followed, and he was successful in his conflict with the locals. Nevertheless, he understood that this would be a very different kind of conflict than battling Confederate forces. He realized the locals rode more quickly and had a greater understanding of the terrain. The Black Hills of South Dakota were acknowledged as a part of the Great Sioux Reservation by a treaty signed by the U.S. government in 1868. But in 1874, Custer led an army expedition that discovered gold in the Black Hills. The United States attempted to purchase the hills after realizing they belonged to the Sioux Nation. The Sioux, however, refused to sell because they saw them as holy territory. Custer had to deal with a band of invading Lakota Sioux at the Northern Pacific Railroad Survey at Yellowstone just a year before, in 1873. Although it was his first meeting with Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, two Lakota leaders, it would not be his last. By January 31, 1876, Custer was supposed to have all local natives relocated to reservations. Any native who disobeyed would be viewed as antagonistic. However, the Indians left their reservations and journeyed to Montana to join Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse at their rapidly expanding camp. The clan eventually made their home on the banks of the Little Bighorn River, numbering in the thousands. People who witnessed the gathered camp claimed to have never seen one this size. Hedar, an Oglala Sioux warrior, claimed that it had come together in March or April. Because of reports of troops coming out to fight from far-off reservations on the Missouri River, camps belonging to different native tribes made it a point to stay near to one another. With the Sioux in the south and the Cheyenne in the north, there were at least 6 or 7 nearby camps. The Hunkpapas were the southernmost of the Sioux. The Sanark, Brule, Minneconjou, Santee, and Oglala were situated between them, along the loops and bends of the river. They were accompanied by 5 Arapaho warriors. A third of the 6,000 to 7,000 individuals who were present were men or youths of fighting age who engaged in actual combat. They had bows, arrows, and tomahawks in addition to Winchester, Henry, and Spencer, repeating rifles. Bull's Sundance sitting, an ancient native rite, was performed prior to the combat. Only men are allowed to participate in the Sundance, a spiritual ceremony. Sitting Bull, a Lakota medicine man, conducted it. He represented the sun by painting himself yellow. A future vision and spiritual direction were what he sought. He started the rite by tearing bits of flesh off his arms until they were completely covered in blood. He then began to dance, and his troops came after him. 2 whole days passed during the dance before Sitting Bull finally had a vision. He foresaw victory in the conflict, but the vision was accompanied by a warning. The Lakota would suffer greatly if nothing was taken from the slain troops. Sitting Bull had numerous future predictive visions before to the Sundance, and each one had proven to be accurate. Thus, this raised the spirits of the natives. The conflict Custer and his 7th Cavalry were among the 3 columns of soldiers sent by the U.S. Army to enlist the Aboriginal people and take them back to their reservations. Colt .45 revolvers and Springfield single-shot carbine rifles were used by the soldiers. After a U.S. Army scouting party consisting of Crow and Arakawa scouts discovered a native trail leading toward Little Bighorn Valley, General Alfred Terry, Colonel John Gibbon, and Lieutenant Colonel Custer convened in mid-June and determined that Custer should encircle the natives and wait for reinforcements. On June 25th, at around noon, Custer's scouts saw sitting the camp of Bull. Custer organized a surprise attack for the following day, moving toward the campsite and shooting a few natives en route, rather than waiting for reinforcements as intended. Custer separated his 600-plus troops into 4 divisions. One small battalion was to remain with the supply train, while the other 2, commanded by Major Marcus Reno and Captain Frederick Benteen, were to strike from the south and stop the locals from fleeing. To make sure no additional native forces could assault their rear, he dispatched Benteen scouting southwest. He then gave Reno the order to go west and attack the camp's south side. With 210 men, Custer headed the last group and intended to launch an attack from the north. From the south, Reno's troops launched the initial onslaught. Taken by surprise, the locals gathered their weapons, formed an organization, and began retaliating. About 100 of the guys in Reno's group had been engaged in combat with the locals. Head Dog and Braveheart were 2 of the Indians that rode out and circled a small hill behind the army. The tribesmen's spirits were raised when Crazy Horse arrived with reinforcements in a flash. When Reno's soldiers realized they were outnumbered and that the indigenous were pursuing them uphill, they immediately withdrew, now facing 2 opposing sides. At least 30 soldiers had died by the time they reassembled on the hill, which is today known as Reno Hill. Custer, meanwhile, galloped north. The majority of the people he observed in the Cheyenne camp were women and children. In an effort to relieve pressure on Reno, he then split his forces, sending 2 companies west to the river. Custer and his 3 surviving troops kept moving north in search of a favorable location to cross the river. When Benteen's soldiers heard the shooting on the south side, they rushed to Reno's defense, and the merged battalions formed an alliance. Crazy Horse and his warriors immediately turned around and began to move toward the middle of the large camp. They were afraid that the camp would be attacked again from the north. On the other bank, they had spotted soldiers moving in that direction. White Thunder led a party of Lakota Sioux to begin moving east at that time, and numerous additional Indians soon joined them. From the dense grass, they began shooting at the soldiers. The 2 companies were shortly attacked by the large number of natives who were moving up that side of the river from the south. To higher ground, the soldiers withdrew. Crazy Horse, meanwhile, kept moving north. White Thunder claimed that Custer had actually been surrounded before they started fighting. While searching for suitable ground to cross the river, Custer gave his men orders to remain in a defensive position. The formation disintegrated as the first line of soldiers were overrun by the indigenous. The second defensive line was now under tremendous pressure as the locals persisted in their attack. The natives were now moving forward from a different direction, so Custer went back to the high ground and dispatched soldiers to stop them. The second line took significant losses and withdrew to the reserve line following some intense fighting. Crazy Horse, on the other hand, was able to successfully enclose the men. Crazy Horse crashed into the soldiers as the warriors began to attack them from one side, encircling them entirely. Many of them perished, while others began to flee in the direction of Custer's position as the locals pursued them. In a panic, Custer's men got off their horses and used them as cover. Custer's final stand wasn't much of a struggle because he was now surrounded on all sides. It was a massacre. Custer and all the men in his battalion were slaughtered in the second attack by the locals. He had sustained 2 gunshot wounds, one to the head and one close to the heart. A hill teeming with locals that appeared to be shooting at objects on the ground caught the attention of a few of Reno's cops who had rode out toward the shooting with their guys. The indigenous were taking care of the injured rather than engaging in combat. Moreover, breaking Sitting Bull's caution by stealing items from the fallen troops. In addition, a larger group of native people than any of the officers had ever seen before moved in their direction. The battle soon started after the men from Reno and Benteen established a protective circle. Until the arrival of General Terry's troops, they fought all day. Now that they were outnumbered, the Native Americans dismantled their camps and withdrew, ending the U.S. Army's greatest defeat in the Plains Wars. Reno's and Benteen's soldiers formed a circled defensive line, and the exchange of fire soon began. They fought all day until General Terry's reinforcements finally arrived. Now it was the natives who were outnumbered, so they packed up their camps and retreated, bringing the largest defeat of the U.S. Army during the Plains Wars to an end. At the end of the battle, the U.S. Army had lost about 280 soldiers, while native losses numbered around 160. Thank you for watching. If you like the content, please like the video and subscribe.